Emperor Haile Selassie I is often remembered for his international achievements. His Majesty achieved tremendous achievements both domestically and internationally. However, in Ethiopia, he is not given recognition for any of the work that he did. And this is because the Ethiopian government has a policy where they rule as a dictatorship and they crush all opposition to their regime. Therefore, there is a policy in Ethiopia to discredit the emperor, as well as the information, the real information on His Majesty is not made available to the Ethiopians. However, outside of Ethiopia, in different countries around the world, the governments do not have the same agenda and the same policy that the Ethiopian government has. Which means that people in different countries, such as in European countries, in Asian countries, and in American countries, these people are able to read the literature on Haile Selassie and investigate what His Majesty did without being under the threat of being killed and put in prison and tortured just because they support the emperor. Ethiopia, unfortunately, has gone through a revolution and has gone through significant changes from their ancient past, and as a result now the Ethiopians do not accept Haile Selassie and they do not give him any recognition or credit for all of the things that he did for Ethiopia. But one of the things that he did for Ethiopia, which we are able to study, is that he liberated Ethiopia. When Mussolini invaded Ethiopia in 1935, Haile Selassie put up resistance, and Mussolini and the fascists, they decided that it would not be another battle of Ottawa. So Mussolini and the fascists used poison gas in Ethiopia to basically kill off all of the Ethiopians. Mussolini said that he will have Ethiopia with or without the Ethiopians. So he was prepared to kill off all of the Ethiopians. As well as the poison gas was mainly aimed at the people on the countryside, not at the warriors. Obviously the warriors was also targeted, but it was mainly used on the regular common people who was farming and just trying to survive on a day-to-day basis. The reason why he targeted the regular people was to crush their morale and for them not to support the resistance against Mussolini's occupation. Haile Selassie being the emperor of Ethiopia, it was his job to protect the people. So faced with the choice of extinction, His Majesty chose to go into exile rather than to allow his people to be annihilated. You see, there is no defense against poison gas. You cannot shoot guns at it, and you cannot fight against poison gas. If people use poison gas against you, the only option you have is to die. You see, poison gas is an outlawed agent. Yet Mussolini used it because that was the only way that Mussolini could defeat Ethiopia, by using the poison gas. So His Majesty had to go into exile and raise awareness of what was going on inside of his country. Because at that time in 1935, people around the world did not know what was happening in Africa and what was happening in the war. As well as these European countries, they was misleading the people into believing that the Europeans are superior to the Africans, and that the Africans was just going to fall over and die once the European army came in. So in order to keep up that facade, they had to fight illegally. Now, His Majesty went to the League of Nations to raise awareness of this. At the League of Nations, he spoke and he gave a great speech that resonated with people all over the world. And all over the world, they supported what Haile Selassie was saying and what he was doing. His Majesty went not only to raise awareness of what was happening in Ethiopia, he went to secure the rights that was promised to Ethiopia as a member of the League of Nations for protection. Because the covenant of the League of Nations says that there is collective security. And collective security meant that no members can attack and take over each other's country. So if one country was attacked, everyone within the League of Nations will come to the defense of that country. That is what collective security meant. So Haile Selassie went to call for this covenant to be enforced. Initially, the League stalled due to their racist policies. They initially did not help Ethiopia. And as a result, the occupation in Ethiopia lasted for 5 years. But eventually, Haile Selassie was able to gain the help of the British, because Mussolini eventually sided with Hitler and went to war and started taking over all of Europe in the same way that they went to war and was taking over Africa. You see, they didn't care about them taking over Africa, but once they started taking over Europe, that's when it became a problem for them. And when it became a problem for them, they started to help Haile Selassie, because their colonies in Africa was also threatened, as well as their country, their mainland was threatened as well by Hitler and Mussolini. So the British had to, at that point, eliminate Hitler and Mussolini. So they helped Haile Selassie. Now, Haile Selassie then came out of exile, came from Britain, and went back into Ethiopia to liberate Ethiopia. So the liberation of Ethiopia in 1941 was not only a domestic policy, it was also an international achievement, because he was successful in what he was calling for at the League of Nations. Not at first, but eventually he was successful. He was able to get help. Once he liberated Ethiopia with a small force of the British and other troops from India and South Africa, once he was able to liberate Ethiopia, the British took on a very devious policy, and they considered Ethiopia to be occupied enemy territory. Now, what that meant was that Ethiopia was not recognized and not given its full rights as an independent nation. And this started another chapter, and a very significant chapter, that eventually led to an achievement on Haile Selassie's part. Now, I'm not going to be able to go into full detail on it, but I'm going to go and highlight some important points about how Haile Selassie was able to stop the British in their attempts to basically rule Ethiopia. You see, the British was a colonial power at that point in 1941. Okay, Britain at that point was the chief colonial power. And they did not have a policy. Their policy was not to allow these African countries to self-govern themselves. And Haile Selassie was not allowed to self-govern just based upon his looks. He had to be very politically in tune and astute to what they was doing. And it took a lot of intelligence and great diplomacy on his part to ensure that Ethiopia was fully liberated. So after the battle with Mussolini, another battle took place with the British, who labeled Ethiopia as enemy territory. So after 41, Britain adopted a policy where they was advisors to Haile Selassie in administrative duties and military internal security. Britain occupied the Ogaden, the Addis Ababa Djibouti Railroad, and the Haid. Britain controlled Ethiopian currency, foreign exchange, imports, and exports. The British minister held precedence over the other diplomatic missions to Ethiopia. So the British held power in Ethiopia after His Majesty fought and defeated Mussolini with the help of the British. They at that point took a policy to control significant aspects of Ethiopia's sovereignty. So His Majesty was faced with a diplomatic battle at this point now, and he needed to figure out how he was going to secure the full rights for the independence of his country. You see, after 1941, not only was the British in control of these significant administrative positions in Ethiopia, the British also took all the military equipment captured in Ethiopia after the war with Mussolini. They openly said that it should not be left to black people. So, again, this is 1941, and the British are significantly racist, have a significantly racist policy at this point. They did not consider any black person to be a person. You know, they considered black people to be inferior. So they was not going to allow Ethiopia to govern themselves, and they was not going to allow Ethiopia to defend themselves, even though the Ethiopians won that right and fought that battle. Haile Selassie and his troops was the ones who liberated Ethiopia with the Gideon force. He had help. He needed help. Basically, all that Haile Selassie needed, the reason why he needed the British and international support was for Mussolini to stop raining poison gas on them. That was the main reason why he needed their help. You see, if Mussolini would have rained poison gas on the British also had those weapons at their disposal as well. You see, as well as these European countries have a policy where even if they're white, a white country is their enemy. Even if Italy is at war with Britain, they they're still gonna continue. They're still gonna consider their white enemy to be greater than their black enemies, and they're now going to treat their white enemies the way they treat their black enemies. They treat their black enemies with no consideration at all. So Haile Selassie knew that by him getting international support, that he would be able to stop Mussolini from raining poison gas all over the country, which was the chief way that Mussolini was able to occupy Ethiopia and to force His Majesty to go into exile. Now back to that point about how these European countries treat each other with more respect than the Africans. In Eritrea, right, because again, when the British came in, they had to fight and eliminate the Italian threat all over East Africa, which included the Italians in Somalia, which included the Italians in Eritrea, which included the Italians in Libya, right, which was all surrounded by Egypt and Sudan, which was under the British administration. So they recognized that they had to eliminate this threat around them, because again, Mussolini declared war on them and sided with Hitler. So in Eritrea, the defeated Italians retained their administrative roles over the Eritreans, because the British felt that the white Italians could not be subjugated to an inferior race. This was their policy. Haile Selassie was faced with a racist policy that did not consider him fit to govern, even though he won those rights and even though it was his country. The Ethiopians are not British. So who are the British to say how and who runs Ethiopia and who controls the currency in Ethiopia and who controls their foreign exchange and their international dealings? Who are the British to say this? But we understand from colonization that this is an unjust and racist policy that they had during that time, that denied the Africans their right to self-determination. So Haile Selassie was the last emperor of Africa. He was the last independent leader. All of the other countries in Africa unfortunately fell to these colonial powers, because these colonial powers had industrialized weapons. Haile Selassie was the last leader of independent Africa. And if he would have fell, and if these colonial powers would have been successful in maintaining a rulership over them, then Ethiopian independence as well as African independence would not have been possible. So His Majesty Emperor Haile Selassie I pushed for a new agreement with the British, a new currency to replace the East African shilling imposed on Ethiopia, and a source for military aid which would free Ethiopia from dependence on the British. So this is where Haile Selassie starts to become a major player on an international scene, meaning that he was able to establish good relations with different countries. And by him being able to establish these good relations with different countries, he was able to play and use one country against another. And where he wasn't able to get help from one country, he was able to get that help from another country. That was the reason why Haile Selassie was going all over the world, because he understood the importance of gaining allies. And the more allies that he can get, the better he would be in a position where he can get what he wanted. And that proved to be successful. So, Haile Selassie I made territorial demands for the annexation of Italian Somalia, the Ogaden, and Eritrea. This challenged the British, who wanted to combine the Ogaden, Italian Somalia, and British Somalia into a greater Somalia. You see, once again, the British was there to rule. The British was there to rule Ethiopia. They was going to take the Ogaden, which is southern Ethiopia, combine that with Italian Somalia and British Somalia to create a new country called Greater Somalia. So this is a significant threat to Ethiopian sovereignty. Okay, so His Majesty challenged them, and he basically was saying that the Ogaden, Italian Somalia, and Eritrea all belong to Ethiopia. And he was able to challenge the British from the international support that he gained from other countries like America, like France, like Russia. His Majesty established diplomatic relations with the United States, and he received Lend-Lease funding, which offset dependence on the British. And in 1954, Ethiopia was fully restored its sovereign rights of independence. Not just in name, but fully with control over their currency, foreign exchange, import, exports, and all administrative positions of their government. So this was a significant achievement for Haile Selassie, to be able to stem the British from ruling Ethiopia covertly. He was able to push them out because he secured help from other countries. He was able to get America to assist him with military funding. And the thing about Haile Selassie also was that he was a very shrewd politician. He was very good at diplomacy. He was very articulate and intelligent. So he was able to get his point across concisely. However, no matter how good your point is, some people still are not going to agree with you. And that's what His Majesty was faced with. Now, when he got this help from America with Lend-Lease, when he was funded by America with Lend-Lease, the British understood that Haile Selassie would go to war if they did not listen to him. So once he was able to get those funds, that was a critical point, because the British understood that Haile Selassie was not going to allow them to continue to tell him what to do in his own country and to control these significant parts of his government. Now, once Haile Selassie was able to gain full independence, he then also played an active role in the United Nations for the other countries of Africa to also be liberated, because he said Ethiopian independence means nothing if all of the countries in Africa are also not liberated. And he also said, if y'all will not listen to reason, then you're going to have to listen to force. That was his policy. He gave great arguments, and he was pleasant to deal with, and he was kind, and he showed respect to these European powers. But he said if they would not listen to reason, then we're going to have to go to war. And this is how Africa became independent in the 1960s. It was because of these actions and these policies of Emperor Haile Selassie I at the forefront as the last independent country of Africa to not just be content with his own sovereignty, but to also push for complete African independence. And this led that movement in the 60s, where the Africans was liberated, as well as independence for the people of African descent in the Caribbean and in the United States of America. All of this is tied in with Africa and Ethiopia and Haile Selassie. So with divide and rule, a lot of people are not able to connect the dots, and they think that what happens in their country is just an isolated event. And nothing could be further from the truth. So this is one aspect of His Majesty's international achievements. The liberation of Ethiopia was not confined to just that country. It involved a lot of political dealings on an international scale. And if His Majesty did not handle that situation properly, then it would have eventually led to the subjugation of all of Africa. So we give thanks and we recognize Emperor Haile Selassie I for the great work that he has done for the liberation of the world.